The question is that the Grand Committee do consider this instrument.
I'm thanking the Noble Viscount for the way in which he introduced these motions this afternoon. A group of us were recalling just before we began the way in which we've discussed this year in, year out. And we were recalling some of his illustrious predecessors and others in all parts of the House who contributed to some of the changes which the Noble Viscount has just referred to. And I was thinking particularly of the late Lord Newton of Braintree, who was Secretary of State and who was a great supporter when I moved amendments in your Lordship's House seeking to change the Criminal Justice Bill and to bring about what then became a full-scale Act of Parliament, the Mesothelioma Act. And indeed it was the Noble Lord Freud who became decisive in making that happen. And of course he once shared with us in this committee how his own father had died of mesothelioma. And on this side of the chamber as well, I think of Lord Mackenzie of Luton, who died at the end of 2021, and it will seem a strange debate without his voice being raised. His attention to granular detail was extraordinary. His knowledge of both pneumoconiosis and mesothelioma was admirable, and I think demonstrated the very best of your Lordship's House, if I can say so. The Noble Viscount has referred to the removal of asbestos from schools. I was very pleased to hear that. That has been a recurring theme that we have raised in these committees over the years. He said that there was a hopeful note when he said that mesothelioma itself may be plateauing. I'd like to come back to the data a little bit later in my own remarks. And he also talked about advances in medical treatments, and he'll know that the Mesothelioma Act was specifically about providing some government funding towards the work the British Lung Foundation and others are doing into looking at the causes and the consequences of mesothelioma and looking for cures. And again, I'd like to ask the Noble Viscount if he can tell us more about whether that funding is being sustained and what progress is being made in that area. One of the things that struck me is the number of noble lords who have shared personal stories of loved ones, families or friends who have died of this disease, which over the distance has claimed more than 30,000 lives, which is the same number of deaths which is still estimated to be caused globally every year. As I've done on previous occasions, I would pay tribute to John Flanagan and the Liverpool-based charity, the Merseyside Asbestos Victim Support Group, and for keeping a candle lit for all those afflicted by mesothelioma. Indeed, in 2020, I noted that in Liverpool, people are more than 18% more likely to die of mesothelioma. I know that we'll hear from my noble friend Lord Wigley and also from the noble Lord Jones, I dare say, during the course of our proceedings, and we've heard from them previously about the situations in Wales, but this is something that is no respecter of geographical boundaries or even of class. And indeed, noble Lord Allen of Hallam and I were discussing this just before the committee met, and we were talking about some of those who have talked about the loss of loved ones. My noble friend Lord Freyberg talked in the House about his sister, a journalist who had died of mesothelioma. The noble Lord McNally talked about his sister who had simply been washing overalls and had died of mesothelioma. The noble Lord Giddens told us about his wife who died of mesothelioma. And we heard also the story of how from Admiral Lord West about how when young men were training for the Navy, they played snowballs with asbestos. And indeed, Jeremy Hunt, the Chancellor of the Exchequer, described how his father, Admiral Hunt, had also died of mesothelioma. So this is not something that is remote, it's something that we know about, but sometimes it's regarded almost like a Cinderella, having Cinderella status. Now, Mr. Flanagan has asked me particularly to ask the Noble Viscount what progress, if any, is being made in connection with the equalisation of government lump payment schemes. And he says that the current arrangements result, and I quote, in the short-changing in the main of widows who are in the predicament of having lost a loved one and being told by government that they must be adversely treated in comparison with other widows who have suffered the same loss. So as much as I welcome what the Noble Lord has said to us in committee, that there will be an increase in the total amounts of money available this year, I'll come back to that in a moment, Nevertheless, this is about equalisation with other schemes, and why is there a discrepancy between how we treat some widows and others? I've got some other requests to the Noble Viscount. A request has been made by the Department to insurers and personal injury lawyers involved in the review of the diffuse mesothelioma payment scheme, let's call it DMPS, the compensation tariff that is provided to that, and the need for those lawyers to provide input and data. And I know that some lawyers involved in this would like the department to recognise that undertaking this is a significant task and has consumed large amounts of time from the lawyers working within those practices. And they have asked for clarification of the methodology to be employed when analysing the data. The request from the department refers to tariff payments being established based upon average compensation figures from civil claims, but in response, lawyers say that as stakeholders, they believe that they're entitled to clarification of the methodology, particularly due to the delay in implementing the review. They've also say they had overreaching concerns in relation to a number of aspects of the scheme and the current remit of the legislation. They argue, and I agree, that those questions should be considered as part of what is now the overdue DMPS tariff review. And perhaps the Noble Viscount will be able to tell us where we're up to with that review. The stated objectives of the scheme include a commitment that payments will rise in line with the Consumer Price Index each year. But as the government have previously stated, and I quote the government's words, if the level of civil compensation also changes, we, that is the government, need to look again at the amount of the scheme payment to see if it should be changed in line with that of civil compensation. Is it still the intention of the government to do that, and what progress are we making in that regard? I'd like the Minister to confirm that these commitments made to mesothelioma victims will be fulfilled. The Secretary of State gave an undertaking to Parliament that the tariff would be reviewed in 2018-19, but that wasn't done. There was a stated commitment that payments would rise in line with the CPI, but again, that hasn't been done. And there's widespread concern and disappointment at the failure to implement a review and maintain the scheme payments in accordance with the undertakings which had been given. And that delay has resulted in DMPS applicants being undercompensated for several years. My Lords, the Secretary of State should provide reasons for that failure, and I think probably at least, if not an apology, give an explanation to mesothelioma victims and their families for what is an unacceptable delay. The limited cost provisions demonstrate that there are clear failings with access to justice and legal representation. The position in relation to legal costs, which was actually the reason I became interested in and involved in this issue in the very first place, when there was an attempt to remove all legal aid for people who had contracted mesothelioma, and thanks to your lordships that did not then happen. But I wonder whether this is going to be considered as part of the terms of reference of any review. Will it look at the exclusion of mesothelioma sufferers who have suffered para-occupational exposure? That might include the likes of victims who were exposed to asbestos as a result with contact with family members whose clothing, I gave an example before, and persons who were contaminated with asbestos fibres, or individuals who have suffered from environmental asbestos exposure, for example, through living in proximity to industrial operations liberating asbestos fibres. There are also clear inconsistencies, my Lords, in terms of compensation levels, payment of medical treatment costs, access to justice, limitation, deduction of state benefits, and eligible classes of claimants. Will they be considered in the review? And finally, my Lords, it appears that the numbers of claims for mesothelioma fell during the pandemic period. It's been referred to by the Noble Viscount, and various reasons for this might include less diagnoses being made, death certificates which recorded other conditions during the pandemic as the cause of death rather than mesothelioma, potential problems with access to justice. All of that may well distort data and favour an average tariff based on 6 years of data as being weighted towards older, lower settlement levels. What we do know is that although there's been some plateauing in the figures, as the Noble Viscount told us, over 5,000 asbestos-related disease deaths occurred each year, with 2,544 mesothelioma deaths in Great Britain in 2020. And that was a rise that year compared with 2019. But similar to the averages, of 2,523 deaths per year over the previous 8 years. Put another way, that's more than 7 deaths caused by mesothelioma every single day. Perhaps the Noble Viscount, when he comes to reply, can reassure us that we're not taking our eyes off this killer disease, and also tell us what contribution His Majesty's Government is currently making into the causes, hopefully the cures, in combating this terrible disease.
My Lords,